Basically, everything else you can think of gets worse with insulin resistance. That's why it's the #1 health problem. And we've never seen anything like it where the majority of the world has something. And it's not about diabetes, it's about metabolic poor health that leads to cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia.
Destruction can be happening in the background for 10, 15, 20 years before blood glucose actually starts to rise and the A1C goes up.
Which is why it's so crazy that they're measuring glucose and they're not measuring insulin. One of the first things is going to be that you have less energy. You can crash after meals. Weight gain, some of that is going to go into a fatty liver, into visceral fat. You have more hunger and cravings. We have to understand that it's not about willpower. If you're high insulin, you will get hungry. There is only one way out of this, and it's to dramatically educate people and change lifestyles. Fewer meals that don't jack up blood sugar and insulin. And the body responds amazingly well.
Dr. Ekberg, why do you think insulin resistance is the biggest health problem facing the world today?
Because the majority of people on the planet have some degree of it. So officially, they set the rate, like prediabetes is defined as a 5.7 A1C. But to me, if you're at 5.5 A1C, you're kind of slipping. You're on your way there. If you're not stable and healthy and insulin sensitive at an A1C of 5 to 5.3, if you're above that, chances are that you're kind of slipping and on your way up. And I think there's like 30-40% of the US population is officially pre-diabetic, but there's like 80% who are in that slipping zone. And around the world and around the globe, I think we're talking 60, 70, 80% of the world's population have some degree of it. And prediabetes is basically what they say is if you don't change things in your life, in your lifestyle, then you'll probably have diabetes in 5 to 10 years. That's why they call it pre-diabetes, because if you don't change, you'll probably get it. So what that means is we're looking at an epidemic here for the world where most people on the planet are heading to that stage. And it's not about diabetes, it's about metabolic poor health that leads to cardiovascular disease, that leads to stroke, that leads to dementia, and basically everything else you can think of gets worse with insulin resistance. So that's why it's the #1 health problem. And we've never seen anything like it on that scale where the majority of the world has something.
Let's talk about the mechanism, what people are doing, and then the underlying physiology as somebody walks into this.
So we're designed for feast and famine. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. They had seasons, they had growing seasons, they had probably more food in the summer than they had in the winter. So we had a way of putting on weight, of storing fat as a reserve for the winter. And same thing on a shorter scale, if we hunted a woolly mammoth or we were lucky, we got some good results from a hunt, then they would eat as much as they could, and then the body would store the excess as fat. So the next 3-4 days, when they may not have as much, then the body could pull off of those resources and burn that fat for energy until the next meal. But the problem is we are never short of a meal anymore. And then in addition to that, we stopped eating food. We started eating candy and drugs, because basically everything with sugar in it is a drug. It's extremely addictive. And everyone knows that if you eat a big fat steak, then you're going to be full for a long, long time. If you eat a bag of potato chips, then you're still hungry an hour later. And the same thing goes with virtually any processed foods or any cookies or a soda, anything with sugar and anything with processed grain in it. It is very, very, it's satisfying in an addictive way, very short term. But then you're hungry a couple hours later, and now you go eat again and again and again. And I've often used the analogy of a pantry. So the purpose of a pantry is to put something in so that you can take it back out, right? And that's what our ancestors did. They ate, they put some reserves in fat storage, and then the next few days or over the winter, they retrieved it. But we just keep, with the analogy of a pantry, we just keep shoving things in there, and we never ever take anything out because there's never a shortage. And that's the mechanism. So there's two factors that influence this this overload, and one is the type of food. So we eat sugar, we eat processed grains. That's going to create a blood sugar response that's much, much higher, and an insulin response that's much, much higher. The other factor is the frequency. That if you eat a big steak, you're going to eat, or similar whole food, you're going to eat maybe twice a day. With processed foods, you'll be tempted to eat all day long. So it's the amount of the insulin response and the frequency of the insulin response. And over time, that overwhelms the cell. The cell wants food, but when you try to force feed it, it's going to start saying no. It's going to start resisting that force feeding. And that's what insulin resistance is. Now, when insulin comes knocking, the cell doesn't respond. It's resistant to the action of insulin.
Let's continue the story. So over time, the body's going to make more insulin, trying
Correct.
to get that fuel into the cell.
Correct.
Then what happens?
Yeah, so when the cell starts resisting the fuel, now the body gets real nervous. The brain says, hey, I don't like the high blood glucose. I have to keep the glucose at a steady, low, comfortable level. So when it gets higher than that, now the body, like you said, it releases more insulin, and the cell becomes more insulin resistant, and the cell releases more insulin, and so on and so on. So this is how the body has to keep the glucose down, but it does it at the expense of working really, really hard and producing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times more insulin than a healthy person. So now we have those chronically high levels of insulin that start doing damage on its own.
Early on, you talked about A1C. Let's bring that back in and explain that takes a certain period of time before we start seeing a change there.
Yes.
Because of this increased insulin that's coming in, bringing blood glucose down. So the A1C is such a late marker to what you're talking about here.
Glucose, yes. Glucose and A1C is a late marker because it could be 10, 15 years before it changes significantly. And A1C is basically, it's a type of protein in the red blood cell. And glucose is sticky. So glucose and protein tend to stick together. And once they find each other, they don't let go. So then we can go and measure how many percent of this A1C protein has glucose stuck to it. So that's basically the number that we get on the test. And there is a big difference between 5% A1C and 5.7 or even 5.5. And this measurement, because we're measuring the amount of sugar stuck to a protein in a red blood cell, the time period that we're talking about is how long a red blood cell lives, which is typically around 100 days. That's just a ballpark number. Some people say 90, some say 120, but you figure it's 3 months average of your blood glucose. So once you start making changes in a positive direction, the A1C is going to lag behind because it's not going to show you until 3 months later where you really are.
The point I want to make sure we highlight, though, is that if somebody's just looking at A1C, destruction can be happening in the background for 10, 15, 20 years before blood glucose actually starts to rise and the A1C goes up.
Yes, yes. And I actually did a dedicated video to that I released this morning that's pretty interesting. It talks about 10 different things that you can notice before your blood sugar rises that are due to insulin resistance. So you're absolutely right that the way I want to emphasize is you can't measure a controlled variable. Okay, glucose, it's super important for the body to keep it steady. If it goes up, the body releases insulin to bring it down. If it goes down, we have counter-regulatory hormones to bring it up. We have glucagon, we have cortisol, adrenaline, growth hormone, to make sure that we don't fluctuate. So the body has these wonderful systems where we can eat food and we can go without food for days, and that blood sugar is not going to change much, right? So measuring blood glucose doesn't tell us a whole lot because the body is working so hard at keeping it at that level. It's not showing us what's going on, and it's only going to change significantly after the whole regulation system basically fails. When it's worn out, when it's fatigued, when it has no more resources or tools to put into the fight, now we're going to see that blood glucose go up, which is why it's so crazy that they're measuring glucose and they're not measuring insulin. Insulin is the factor that shows us how hard is the body working at trying to control this glucose. So measuring the glucose makes no sense because it's not supposed to change.
And to highlight another point here too is that if you're waiting for that blood glucose to rise, insulin being chronically elevated is causing health issues.
Correct.
If you get to the point where that blood glucose is starting to go up and you've been pushing it for 10, 15, again, 20 years, blood glucose being elevated is going to cause a whole nother slew of problems.
Yes. Yeah. So once the system fails and you see these blood glucose levels, like diabetic is defined as 129 or 125 or whatever. But once you're there, a lot of people will have 200 and 300 in blood glucose. And what happens now is you change the characteristics of the blood. It gets thicker, and glucose starts leaking out into the tissues around blood vessels. So it basically causes swelling in the tissues around the blood vessels. And this is especially for microvessels. And the places, two of the important places where we have a lot of microvessels are in the eyes and in the kidneys. So that's why diabetes is the number one cause of blindness, the number one cause of kidney failure, and also the number one cause of amputations and neuropathy.
And if you're not aware of what we're talking about today and testing fasting insulin, by the time your doctor figures this out and your blood glucose starts to go up, you're going to have accumulated all kinds of damage over the years.
Yeah.
So again, that ties back to what we opened up with, you thinking this is the number one health challenge right now that we need to emphasize. And the fact that you've already touched on the fact that all these different diseases spring up from this mechanism not functioning right.
Yeah, yeah. We overwhelm the body. So the whole world is obsessed with blood sugar. They treat diabetes as a blood sugar problem only. And the treatment is to either give people more insulin when they already have way too much. That is the problem. Like they have too much, so let's give them more. Or they give you some medication to induce your body to produce more. because they're only looking at the blood sugar aspect of it. So yes, blood sugar is a problem and insulin is another problem, but the insulin goes on for 20 years before the blood sugar is a problem. And treating the blood sugar with more insulin just compounds the problem. And there is only one way out of this, and it's to dramatically educate people and change lifestyles, and to go on stopping processed foods, doing low carb foods that don't jack up blood sugar, and to do intermittent fasting, fewer meals that don't jack up blood sugar and insulin. And the body responds amazingly well. I've had on my channel, I've had tens of thousands of people who say they've lost 100 pounds and they're off all their medications. And it wasn't some magic pill they did. They just stopped eating junk. They started eating real food. And what you find when you eat real food is you don't need 6 meals a day. You don't need snacks. Your body doesn't even want them.
What I am happy is coming up early on in the conversation is this hope piece. Because somebody thinking to themselves, I'm likely in this boat, I've done all this damage. We're going to talk about those factors that you just brought up later in the interview and give people the path to work back out of this. So there is hope. Even if you've damaged your body, a lot of that can be reversed.
Yes, absolutely. And what I want to say is most people go into this because they want to lose weight. That's their primary concern. And I want to say that for most people, they're going to lose weight also. But even if you don't, it's still worth doing it, because some people's bodies are super stubborn, but you can still reverse your health risk markers without shedding significant weight or even a single pound. So if you go on a diet, if you are diabetic and you have really stubborn weight, there are some people who can do everything right or seemingly right, and their weight is still stubborn. But in a relatively short time, they can still bring down their inflammation. They can still bring down their A1C. They can bring down their insulin. They can dramatically lower their risk markers. So focus on those first. But some people, they're just so focused on the weight that if it doesn't, they hear about this case where someone drops 100 pounds in 6 months and they think that should be me as well. And they wonder, what am I doing wrong? Well, you could have the deck stacked against you in that sense, but it's still worth doing. Look at all the other risk markers, and you can dramatically improve your health, even if the weight is still stubborn.
You talked about this video you released earlier today. I watched it. It's great. Let's talk about some of the top factors there. Somebody's in this boat where they're producing too much insulin chronically. Blood sugar is not elevated yet. What are the signs they can look for to realize I have a problem here before that blood sugar rises?
So one of the first things is going to be that you have less energy and you can crash after meals, because when you're insulin resistant, the cells are resisting the action of insulin. So they can actually be low on fuel, even though there's plenty of fuel circulating around. All right. But the fuel is getting converted into fat by insulin instead of serving the cells. So that's one thing. Another thing is weight gain, of course. That's kind of secondary to the body converting things to fat instead of using it for fuel. And some of that is going to go into a fatty liver and into visceral fat. And there's another one would be that you have more hunger and cravings, because if insulin is high, now the insulin is a fat storing hormone. It's going to shift the tendency towards storing rather than using. And if you can't use it, now you have 500,000 calories stored on your body, but you can't get to them. So your body releases hunger hormones, and it finds another way to get more sugar, more carbohydrates. And then when you eat those, then you turn them into fat because you're insulin resistant. So that's kind of the whole core of this mechanism, that you're not utilizing fuel properly. You're not controlling your hunger signals. And that's one of the biggest things is people ask, well, which diet is the best? Well, it's whichever one you can control hunger and that you can stay on for the rest of your life, right? That's it. And if that's steaks, or if that's vegetables, or if it's a combination, then just figure out what that is for you. But sugar ain't it, because sugar is not a stable, nutritious source.
When you say diet for the rest of your life, my only pushback there is somebody overweight, metabolically unhealthy. If they want to do this in the quickest way possible, they might want to jump to a carnivore or keto diet. And then as they regain metabolic health over time, they may be able to and want to introduce more carbs. Would you agree with that?
I think it's totally okay to do something like carnivore as a reset. Okay. I'm not, the jury is still out on this. We don't really know what happens to the body on carnivore. I think it's better to do a mix of meat. I do meat-based. I eat a lot of meat, but I also eat a fair amount of vegetables. And I believe that we eat meat for the human cells, and we eat vegetables to feed the microbiome. And we do know for a fact that a carnivore is going to drastically reduce their microbiome. And that's going to reduce their ability to eat other foods. Now, I think that is probably a potential problem, because the gut bacteria do so much in terms of immunity and neurotransmitters and metabolic signaling. But we don't know for sure if the carnivore microbiome is good enough. They just can't eat vegetables anymore because they don't have the bacteria to process it. But we don't know for sure if that's a bad thing. I think there is a drawback to it, but the jury is still out. So if you start on carnivore or you start on keto and you eat just lots of meat and fat and non-starchy vegetables and leafy greens, you're going to be pretty much in a ketogenic diet. And I think that's how you should eat for the rest of your life. Now, there is a transition, like you said. Well, what about if someone gets metabolically healthy? What if they meet their weight goals or their markers are fine? Well, now what I think you do is you keep eating those foods and you introduce a little bit of healthy carbs. And a lot of people, including me, will feel better doing that. But when I eat grains, I try not to eat like the processed stuff. I eat some of the German rye bread where you can still see like the whole kernel, the whole grain in there. And I eat rice sometimes, but I don't get up to, it's not 60% of my calories, right? I might eat 100 grams of carbs, but not every day. So on my carb day, that would be like 100 grams if I have something with rice. And then people just have to figure out where on that scale do they fit? What works best for their body? But I still think when we say diet, you should be on a diet of food, of actual real food. And to me, that's pretty much like a paleo based. I don't love the word paleo because people turn everything into a religion, and now they start like nitpicking this and that. I don't think that's how we want to think about it, but I think it's a fantastic foundation because it says we should eat what our ancestors eat because that's what our DNA is designed for. And like 90% of the stuff in the grocery store is not food. That's the main thing that we have to understand.
I want to make sure I fully understand the keto piece. For you specifically, somebody metabolically healthy, it sounds like you have days where you're going up to 100 grams of carbs. How often are those? And then how often are you keto?
I don't actively pursue keto anymore, and I don't measure it, but I probably am keto like a third of the time. And so I love having a nice ribeye and just have a side salad, or I'll do some tabbouleh without any grain in it. So it's basically just leafy greens or non-starchy veg and a steak. And if you do that 2 days in a row, you're going to be in keto. And then I might have a rice day, which is maybe 1 day or maybe 2 days a week that I do something like that. But again, if I had an A1C that I was trying to lower, then I wouldn't put that carb day in. And even I think it's good to shake things up. Even for a diabetic who is trying to reverse something and who is hardcore keto, I think it's good maybe one day to have 50 grams of carbs and just get out of ketosis. And I don't really have any scientific foundation for this. I haven't looked if there's been any studies, but I just, based on my understanding of the body, I think it's good to change things up. We never want to keep things exactly the same. We want to keep the body guessing a little bit because if it has to shift some things around and adapt, that's always good.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand the keto piece because for me, right now I'm keto and I have more energy. I can get less sleep. I have young kids. I'm often up during the night with them. I just feel better. I feel like Superman. So for me to go 1 or 2 days and have 100 grams of carbs, as an entrepreneur, somebody, performing and needing to think clearly as I record the show and on, I don't feel I would be at my best. And I haven't been doing this a long time, so I can't say that over time my thoughts might change. But I'm always just curious, people that dabble in ketosis and feel that benefit, why they wouldn't want that all the time.
Then that's another thing that we have to weigh into the equation is how do we feel? If we function super, if we feel great, if we have energy, then yes, that's a strong reason to stick with it. But I would also say if you do that keto, then try to make sure you get enough leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables. Because I know a lot of people who do keto who sort of messed up their biome. They felt so good on the fat energy, which is what keto is basically, that they put a low priority on vegetables, and over time their gut changed to where they got more sensitivities, and sometimes it backfired where it stopped working. So we got to pay attention to how we feel and how are all the different things working, and just try to eat a variety of food, I think.
I had asked you about this period of time when insulin's going up chronically, before blood sugar changes, at least in a dramatic way. Any other additional things we can look for there to be aware if we're in that position?
Well, watch my video. I don't remember even all the the 10 things that I put in there, but I did mention back to you the key ones. And something else to look for on a basic blood test is triglycerides. So the medical tests, the standard tests in most states are not going to flag it until it's over 150. And to me, that's way, way too high. Okay, that's kind of like insulin getting up being in the 20s. It should be between 2 and 5. Should definitely be single digits. But they don't flag it because they don't understand it. They don't understand the subtlety of the process that's going on. And triglycerides is the same way. I think triglycerides should be between 50 and 80. And some labs, they will kind of put a little caution if it's over 100, but most won't flag it until 150. I think it should be significantly lower than that, because what's happening if triglycerides are going up, that's a sign that the liver is starting to accumulate fat. It is converting a lot of that fat into VLDLs, with very low density lipoproteins, which are carriers. They're transport vehicles of triglycerides. So they make those to deliver fat to the body for usage. But if the cells are already overfed, they're going to reject those triglycerides and they're going to stay in the bloodstream. So that's how we get the high triglycerides. Another thing that happens is if you're insulin resistant and the cells don't take up the glucose, one way for the body to get rid of the glucose is to convert it into triglycerides. And the liver does that on an ongoing basis. So as soon as triglycerides go up just a little bit, that's a very strong indicator of insulin resistance.
Okay, so triglycerides we want to look at. Fasting insulin, to me, that would be the primary one. Anything else if we're looking at metabolic health that you'd like to see?
Uric acid is another one, and it's not as clear cut because it can rise for different reasons. A lot of it's dietary based, but uric acid, high levels of insulin will prevent the kidneys from properly getting rid of uric acid. So that one can go up. But again, it's not as clear cut because it's a good early sign, but there are other things that can also affect it.
Fatty livers come up a couple times. Let's talk about where along the continuum of insulin resistance that typically starts, and then the mechanism.
I don't have a lot of good data. Fatty liver, we know, like if you have a big belly and high insulin levels, you're 95% sure you got a fatty liver. But other than that, there's no simple diagnostic test. You really don't. I mean, some of the more secure ways is to do like a biopsy, but you really don't want to go poking holes in your liver if you don't have to. It's quite invasive and there's some risks and stuff. So they don't really test it. They can do it with ultrasound, but again, it's not conclusive. And early stages of insulin resistance don't produce like a full-blown fatty liver. So in my mind, it's more of a continuum, just like insulin is. So I think that we have a fatty liver in proportion to our insulin levels. And early on, it's not a big deal, but the further we go, that fat-packed liver can start malfunctioning because it's just too full of fat.
And isn't it true as we become metabolically unhealthy, the pancreas can take on fat too?
Yes, all organs can basically. And some people think that type 2 diabetes is when the pancreas fails, but that is actually a totally different story. Most type 2 diabetics have a perfectly functioning pancreas. And this is evidenced by the fact that if you measure their insulin, they're very, very high levels. So their pancreas is fully capable of pushing out, producing insulin. It's just that the cells are so resistant that no matter how much insulin, it doesn't really do the job.
When it comes to fatty liver, fatty pancreas, to reverse those, is the protocol the same as what we've been talking about? Well, we haven't really got into in depth, but when we reverse insulin resistance, is it all the same, or is there specifics depending on what you're trying to get?
No, there's some tissues that are slightly different. Like there's more insulin receptors and more cortisol receptors in the visceral organs than there are in subcutaneous fat. So those tissues turn over a little faster. They're a little faster to accumulate fat, and they're a little faster actually to let go of fat. But other than that, the mechanism is the same, that there is only one way. If insulin created the problem of putting too much fat in storage, the only solution is to lower insulin by whatever means we need to do that. And we'll talk about those, I'm sure. But like I mentioned, the medical solution is to give people more insulin. It's totally inconceivable. It's completely absurd to me. Once you really understand the model and the mechanism, that the problem is too much insulin, then why are we giving people more? Because you're compounding, you're controlling blood sugar at a level, you're making cardiovascular disease and dementia and all the other issues get worse. And the solution is relatively simple.
Well, to me, when you start giving insulin, you're extending out what the body's already been doing for that 10, 15 years. You're continuing to keep blood glucose at bay, but you're ramping up that insulin even more, causing all kinds of problems and not even addressing the root.
Yeah. To me, I use the word congested a lot when I try to describe these things. Again, our ancestors, they put some things in storage and they took them out. We put something into a pantry and we take it out. If we never take anything out, it gets congested. It gets clogged up. We have to have a turnover, an exchange. And that's what this is about. And if you think about people when they get overweight and they get swollen and their bodies stop functioning, we've overfed, we've congested the body. And we have to understand that it's not about willpower, right? You can't just say, I'm going to eat less, because your body wants to survive. Your body is going to, if you're high insulin, you will get hungry. Insulin resistance makes you hungry. So you can't attack the problem at the level of willpower. There's like one in 100 can do that, right? I don't know how they do it. They just decide, and I'm going to stop eating. I don't care if I suffer, and they'll pull it off. But we know the success record of dieting. 98% of people fail. They go on a diet, they get off a diet because it was horrible. And that's not the way. You can't solve the problem with what's the word? Deprivation. You can't deprive yourself and suffer and solve the problem.
Let's bring in visceral fat. And this is the cousin to liver fat, pancreas fat. It's in the same area, but now we're talking about the fat within the abdominal cavity. You mentioned it quickly. Let's talk about what that is and why it's so dangerous.
It has more. I think the biggest thing is if there's a disease called Cushing's syndrome. And those are usually people with like an adrenal tumor. That's where the adrenal glands, that's where cortisol is made. If you have a tumor there, that it could be a benign tumor, but it's an endocrine tumor that makes a hormone, namely cortisol, and it just keeps overproducing it. So you have extremely high levels all the time. Well, those people, they have all the extremes of what cortisol does. Okay, they get a round, they call moon face. They get a buffalo hump because the fat accumulates on the back of the upper back. They get stretch marks and striations because the skin is protein, and the cortisol tries to make glucose. That's the number one reason for cortisol is it's a stress hormone. When we have stress, we want more glucose. So cortisol tells the body to make more glucose. Well, part of the way it tells you to get glucose by giving you cravings, but it also does it by breaking down protein. So chronic high levels of cortisol will break down protein. It'll break down skin. It will break down muscle. So you're cannibalizing your skin and your muscles. You get saggy, brittle skin. If you get a bruise, it tends to get exceedingly large and heal slowly. They get huge bellies. They get skinny legs because the cortisol eats up all the muscles in the large muscles like the butt and the thighs. And that's what cortisol does. So belly fat is an indication of insulin, but also very much of cortisol. Because belly fat, visceral fat, has more cortisol receptors and more insulin receptors. So visceral fat is associated with all these destructive stress responses. And I think that's one reason that the visceral fat is considered dangerous. I don't think per se that it's necessarily, it does have some different signaling properties, but I think the main thing is that it indicates that we have more cortisol in the body as well.
For somebody who feels they might be in that position, too much cortisol, how do they assess? And then how do they address that piece?
That's a good question. Because cortisol, it's kind of hard to test. The best test is like a 24-hour saliva gathering test. But even so, it's not all that reliable or specific. So I think if you have these signs, then I think you can assume that you have too much cortisol. And I would just encourage people, regardless, to do something about stress, because you have it, whether you know it or not, whether you feel stressed or not. We live in a world with so many deadlines and so much overload that your body is kind of, we get used to it and it becomes our default. And I often talk about the triad of health, which is you have a chemical aspect to your body, that's nutrition, biochemistry. It's all the positive stuff you should eat to give your body nutrients, and it's all the toxins you should avoid that interferes. And then we have a structural component, which is posture and movement. Your body is made to be, it functions best in a certain posture, right? If we're slouching, if we're sitting all the time, the body doesn't work as well. It affects the signals, it affects the feedback to the brain. So trauma and being a couch potato, that interferes with your brain function. So if you have an accident where you start limping, or you're not walking properly, you changed your movement patterns. And it's not like that's the biggest problem you have in life, but it's one of them, right? It contributes to your overall signal pattern in the body. So go do what you can. It's like get a chiropractor, get some physical therapy, do some stretching, do some Pilates, and get as close back to full function as you can. And then it's the emotional part, which is usually where we put stress. And the way I look at it is these are necessities. They're not optional, right? Your body depends on good nutrition. It depends on good movement. It depends on a good mood. That's where we function. A bad mood will shut down everything in your body. And like we just talked about with cortisol, that's just one part of it. That's just one hormone. But in the ways that the body allocates resources and the way it heals versus breaks things down, it has everything to do with our emotional state. So I think if we're interested in health, we should put equal thirds on those three, on our biochemistry, on our movement and posture, and on our emotional state. And we should set aside time. We should watch a funny movie. We should read a book that makes us feel good, an uplifting book. We should do breathing exercises. We should meditate. We should pay attention to how we feel. Like you go through the day and you notice, how am I feeling? Is this how I want to feel? If my cells were listening to me right now, to my internal conversation, to my emotional state, would my body be more inclined to heal or more inclined to put out a fire and break down? So the thing that we want to do is pay attention to how we feel, realize that it is a real thing, and make it absolutely as important as what we eat. And then we start looking for and using different techniques and methods and meditation to give our brains and our bodies that state of healing, that state of bliss and joy that it needs on a regular basis.
You gave a number of examples, but I want to stick on the emotional piece. For you personally, if you're pushing it too hard, stressed, not getting enough sleep, working extra hours trying to get your video ready for Friday morning, what will you do to slow down and dissipate that stress?
I don't do enough, like all of us, I think. But just breathing exercises. As you're laying in bed, last thing at night, first thing in the morning, just take some slow breaths and focus on your state. Do you feel tense? Do you have thoughts racing around in your mind? Are you dreading the day? Are you looking forward to it? Are you anticipating trouble, or are you visualizing the day go well? Those are just little things. And then if you focus on your breath, you put a hand on your belly and you feel the hand rise with the belly, and you breathe 5 seconds in and 5 to 6 seconds out. And the first 4 seconds, you let the belly do the breath, and then you let it expand into your chest just a little bit, and then you just release it. So just doing 1 minute of that breathing is a reset. It changes your mental focus. It interrupts whatever stress pattern is going. And then what I'd like to do more, which I've had periods where I do better, is like a full 20, 30 minutes of a dedicated meditation where I sit and just work on silencing the mind. And the way I do it is I focus on space. I just visualize space around me, visualize space in different parts of my body. Because what happens, and this they've done studies on, is the concept, the image of space, when you can feel space, it automatically puts your brain into alpha brain waves, which is like 8 to 12 hertz, 8 to 12 cycles per second, which is a very relaxed state. It's right above like meditation. Meditation tends to go down a little bit lower, but you could use like almost instantaneously, you could bring it from beta, which is often in the 20 hertz range, and bring it down to about 12, 8 to 12, and you have a totally different experience.
We'll make sure we come back to chemical and spend a good amount of time there. But let's do structural. And because our thesis today is metabolic dysfunction, somebody wanting to incorporate more movement in their lives, to become more insulin sensitive, to move their body and burn off blood sugar, what do you recommend for them?
So I want to just preface this a little bit. And the number one reason that we should move and exercise is for the brain. And as far as the brain goes, the more complex, the more challenging, the more varied, the more elements of complexity and balance that are involved, the more the brain develops, the better the brain gets. All right, so that's for brain health. Now, you said metabolic health, and I'm glad you did that because that's an important distinction. Now, for metabolic health, so assuming with metabolic health, and most people who engage in this are overweight and insulin resistant. Now, what they want to try to do is they want to try to burn as much fat as possible while keeping cortisol as low as possible. So when we do what's called aerobic exercise, that means with air, and that means that we're burning almost entirely fat, like somewhere 90-95% fat, because that's what most of our tissues prefer. And when we work at a low enough level, which is usually about 60 to 70% of our maximum heart rate, then the body can easily provide enough oxygen to sustain this fat burning, which takes place in the mitochondria. And when we do this, one of the easiest ways to gauge where you are is how hard are you breathing. So you should breathe harder than you and I are doing right now, but you shouldn't be huffing and puffing, right? You should be able to speak a sentence or most of a sentence, and you might get a little winded, but in that range, you're aerobic, right? You're breathing a little harder, but you're providing oxygen to maintain that fat burning, that pure fat burning. Now, if you increase the intensity to 75, 80%, and your heart rate goes up just a little bit, now you start huffing and puffing. And we want to understand, what does that mean? Why is the body starting to do that? And it's because the baseline fuel isn't enough anymore, right? The fat oxidation is not enough. We got to bring in another fuel, which is glucose. And as soon as you start huffing and puffing and the body tries to bring in more glucose, it releases cortisol to do that. So that subtle shift to go from like a winded but not huffing and puffing and into that huffing and puffing is a metabolic shift. And now we are burning more glucose, we're raising our cortisol. And if we do that for a very short time, like if there's a little hill there and we just do that for a minute, that's not a big deal. But if we try to push this for 30, 40 minutes, we're in a gym class somewhere with a very excited instructor who tries to push us, That's not necessarily the best thing for someone who is overweight and insulin resistant, because now you're starting to drive that cortisol, which you probably, if you have some belly fat, you probably already have too much cortisol. And now that you went from burning almost exclusively fat to burning some carbohydrate, your body is going to want to replenish that carbohydrate afterwards, and you get cravings. So this is why you want the most important diet, so to speak, is where you control your hunger, but engaging in something that produces cortisol might change that, might make it harder for you to stick to those whole foods and those low carb foods. So that's the first part. So we want to burn fat without triggering cortisol. Now, the good thing about walking or biking at a leisurely level is that, yes, we're burning up almost exclusively fat, but we are burning a little bit of glucose as well, but not so much that we need to make cortisol, all right? And muscles, while they are working, will actually pull glucose out of the bloodstream at a modest rate, not like the cortisol rate, but a modest rate without insulin, right? So you're utilizing a small amount of glucose without the need of insulin. And that's another important side factor in this. You're burning mostly fat, you're using some glucose, but it does not require insulin. So you're still allowing your insulin to drop. If you're fasting or intermittent fasting, now you can do that without upsetting your body. You're burning the fat like you want, you're not stressing your body, so you go and crave carbs afterwards. And then another thing that I often say that you should add is just a tiny bit of high intensity interval training. So we want to do the low end of the intensity spectrum for hours, as much time as you have to dedicate to it, and motivation, do it. If you want to do 2 hours a day, that's fine. Then we go to the other end, which is the extreme max of the spectrum, and that's called high intensity. So here what's happening is you're pushing your body to its max for just a few seconds, like 15, 20 seconds. And now your heart rate goes through the roof, your cortisol goes through the roof, but it's only for 15 seconds, right? So very short term is not going to create a chronic problem. And the reason you want to consider this high intensity is that when you max out your body, when you push it to failure, you're challenging your body. You're saying, you got to get better. You got to become more of an athlete, because the state you're in right now isn't enough for the things I'm going to do to you. So in order to do this, when you max out your body to failure, basically, it increases your growth hormone by several fold, not like 5 or 10%. I forget the number, if it's like 300, 400%, something like that. And that growth hormone is also a little boost for fat burning, and that stays up for a few days. It declines gradually, but it stays elevated for several days.
Somebody incorporating the latter, the high intensity, how often should they do it, if they're healthy enough, obviously?
Yeah.
And how long per session?
I say 15 seconds per interval. That could be 30 also. And the rest could be anywhere from 15 seconds to 2 minutes. It depends on how intense you do it. If you do a 15, 20-second rest, your performance is going to go down. You're going to get more and more tired, and you're not going to be able to like have the same speed or effort toward the later half of the workout. But that's not a problem unless that's what you're looking for. Like when I was an athlete and I was training for Olympics and such, the longest I ever ran on a regular basis was 150 meters. But I do a few warm-ups just to get in the pace where I wanted to be. And then I would do 6 times 150. And I could have done those with a minute rest, but then the last one would be horrible. It would be stumbling, it would be bad form. That's not what I was going for. I wanted to do all of them at competition speed for the 400. All right. So I wanted to do all of them under 18 seconds. So the first few were easy, but between number 5 and 6, I had to take like a 5-minute rest. But when I checked my heart rate, it would be, I do a warm-up, so it was maybe 120 when I started, but then after one, it would be maybe 180. And then I walk back, and the next one, I typically would restart them when my heart rate was like 130, 140, when the lactic acid was low enough that I could do one with good form. But I would still hit heart rates over 200 on those. So for me, that workout might take 30, 40 minutes, and my heart rate would never go below 130. So it was like a pretty intense, and of course, that's not something you want to do if you're insulin resistant and 60 years old. I couldn't even think of doing that today. But if all you're looking for is the hormonal effects, all you're trying to do is exhaust yourself to the point of failure. So now you can do 30, like on an exercise bike, do 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, and you're going to get more and more tired for each one, but hopefully you'll hit your max heart rate or within 5 points of your max heart rate within 5 or 6 intervals. So that might be a total of 5 or 6 minutes for the whole workout. And these you don't want to do more than twice a week, probably. If you're younger and an athlete, you might want to do them every other day, but you don't want to do this every day for sure, because they will break you down and you need time to recover between. Otherwise, you just continually go downhill.
I want to come back to your time as an Olympian and talk about over all these years, all the learning you've done, diet-wise, exercise-wise. How different would it be with the knowledge you have now going back to that time?
I think it would be very different because I knew absolutely nothing. I was just the average guy when it came to nutrition. I read a few books and they told athletes that you should eat. That was like the zone diet and the whatever diet, and athletes should eat tons and tons of carbs. That's all we heard. And I did. And I probably ate 1,000 plus grams of carbs per day. And I was 3% body fat as determined in underwater tank weighing. We had some university near us that wanted guinea pigs, so we showed up. But I have favorable genetics, and I worked out 6 hours a day. So it didn't matter what I ate. I would not get fat. I would not put on excess weight. I had to work really, really hard for every pound of muscle that I added. And it took me years and years to add significant muscle. But it doesn't mean that was healthy food, right? Because there was a lot of processed grain, there was a lot of sugar in there. And if I had known better, I think with more meat and fat, I think, and more nutritious food, I think I would have had more stable energy. And I think that I would have had fewer injuries. Because that's what slows down or stops a lot of athletes are injuries. You do really well for a few years when you're younger. You have this breakthrough and you seem unstoppable. But very often there's an injury that changes that trajectory, which it certainly did for me.
I know another part of your history was becoming vegetarian for 7 years.
Yeah.
Was that after the Olympics?
Yes. So that was when I started chiropractic school and I started learning about and taking an interest in the body and learning about different things. Then I read a few books, and not really knowing that much yet, I was convinced by a few bad arguments, and it just seemed like a good idea. And then I think also a girlfriend at the time had an influence in wanting to be nice to animals and so forth. But I still remember one of the big arguments that the book made that was part of convincing me, and that was that, like, during World War II, when there was meat rationing, the rate of heart disease, the rate of chronic disease, everything went down. People got way healthier. But what they failed to say was that they rationed everything. And they rationed sugar, they rationed white flour, they rationed just about anything. So in retrospect, or soon thereafter, I realized that this was not about the meat. It's harder to overfeed yourself when there's rationing.
What was the biggest change to your health during that time?
I don't know. I didn't really suffer. I think I got a little bit skinnier. I think I had a little less vitality overall. But toward the end of that period, I just felt like my body was starting to ask for more substantial food.
I want to come back to exercise for the metabolically unhealthy. Make sure we fully round that off. So far, we want to do low intensity in general, keep the cortisol down, bursts of HIIT for the people that can do that. What about resistance training and tying that into the metabolic health piece?
Yes, absolutely. And resistance training, you can do those along the whole spectrum from low to high intensity. So if you're just kind of walking around in the gym and you're just doing some machines while you're looking on your phone or reading a book or watching TV, that's still good, right? It's a low intensity. You can do it all day long. You're still loading up your muscles and you're still getting some motion through the joints. You're just not going to build strong muscles, right? You're not really going to change your muscles at all because you're not challenging them enough to give the body a reason to add more. But there's nothing wrong with doing that. But you can also turn it into an anaerobe workout, which I don't recommend a whole lot. If you do a circuit training where you kind of push yourself for a minute and then you go to the next one, now you can keep your heart rate at 130, 140 for a long period of time. But you can also do it as high intensity. And now you want to have machines that can safeguard you. You want to have spotters if you do free weights. And now you start doing sets. So you might start with a set of 8, let's say, and then you raise the weight and you do 6. And then you load on so much weight that maybe you could do 5, maybe not. But you go with spotters or you have a machine and you go until you fail. It's like if they gave you $1,000 for one more, you couldn't do it. Like you literally fail. And this is also a high intensity workout. And you're also triggering the same growth hormone as when you hit your max heart rate. So there's basically two ways of doing this. You can do it with max heart rate, or you can do it by going to failure. And it works better if you use a large muscle group, like a squat machine. You want to use like quads and glutes to use a large muscle group to generate a lot of this growth hormone. But then you can do a couple of these to failure, and you got your HIIT workout. And again, you don't want to do this every day. This is and the people who, like weightlifters and bodybuilders, they know they divide their workouts into different body parts. So they'll do upper body one day and leg the next day and rest on the third day. So that way they get 72 hours between body parts, because they really break down that body part.
The other part I think it's important we talk about is building muscle is going to expand glucose sponges as those muscles become larger.
Yes. And there's a misconception here also. I was curious and I did some research, and a lot of people will say that the more muscle you have, that you, like if you replace fat with muscle, that your basal metabolic rate is going to go way up. That's not true. It'll go up, but it's so marginal, it's not really even a factor. But what is true is that with larger muscles, they become larger sponges when you use them. So I want to make that distinction, because that was a notion that was thrown around so much that I wanted to understand it. And I forget the exact numbers, but we're talking like massive amount of muscles. You might burn 50 calories more per day, maybe. But people make it sound like, oh, if you just have enough muscles, they'll just take care of all your energy usage. They'll use up, every excess you have. And it just doesn't work like that. But to me, the biggest thing about muscles, though, is they improve your quality of life. Because we have to assume that between ages 60 and 80, or 60 and 90 or whatever, you're going to lose half your muscle. Those are just the changes of aging. So you want to make sure that you have at least twice as much muscle at 60 as you think you're going to need at 90, right? But most people at 90 are barely mobile. And that's, I think, the biggest reason we want to think a little bit ahead. We want to be in better shape now than we think we need to be, so that we have that quality of life when we get up to 70 and 80.
How do you feel about walks after meals to manage blood sugar? And to me, I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I can see the benefit of bringing blood sugar down, but I feel like you're also wrestling against your body, who wants the blood to go to digestion. If you're pulling that away to your legs to go for a walk, I could see how that could impede digestion. So just curious how you think about it.
I had the same exact question not long ago, because I've been thinking about this, but very recently I actually looked into it. And it's still beneficial to walk after a meal, because you want to keep it very leisurely. It's like no speed walking. You're not trying to accomplish anything here. You're just trying to get a little bit of circulation going. And the heart is not set at a certain rate. Okay, it can increase based on demand. And if you go for a leisurely walk, your heart rate might go up 20 beats per minute to compensate for that, but it still provides plenty of blood for your digestion. So your digestion isn't suffering. The heart is just increasing its productivity to provide for that additional activity. But again, it's a leisurely walk. It's not speed walking. We're not trying to exercise here.
All right, good to know. Physiology-wise, somebody that decides to go for a walk fasted versus after a meal or in between meals, the difference there, and who is that right for?
So there's a lot of nuances to that, but if you do it fasted, like if you're doing, it depends on how long your fasting is. If you're doing an extended fast, now what's happening is you're further increasing your ketones, your autophagy, you're further sort of adding to all the benefits of the fast, as long as you don't start breaking down muscle fiber, right? So you don't want to do like heavy resistance training. The squats to failure that we talked about is a really bad idea during an extended fast because your body doesn't have any protein to repair with. But if we're just talking like, again, a leisurely or an aerobic walk without huffing and puffing, you can do that really at any time. And if you fasted, you're going to increase those benefits of the fast. You're going to lower your blood sugar typically, unless you get into that cortisol range. And as long as you're kind of feeling relaxed about it. Did that answer it, or are there other scenarios you were wondering about?
No, that's great. But let's stick on fasting. Somebody wanting to use that as a tool to improve metabolic health. First of all, who's that right for? And then we'll walk our way into a prolonged fast, starting with somebody having their last bite of food. And let's extend that over a number of days and talk about some of the different benefits they would get.
So intermittent fasting, to me, should be the default lifestyle. And now I'm just talking 14, 16, 18 hours. Because a lot of people, when we're taught to eat 3 meals plus 3 snacks, most people will start eating the first thing they do in the morning and the last thing before going to bed. So they basically have 8 hours without food. So, and here we're talking like we started out with the pantry. We put things in the pantry, but we're not allowing any time to take things out. So even just going from 8 hours to 12 hours is a big improvement. Okay, it increases our ability to create turnover in that pantry. And then if we have a metabolic issue, now we want to try to increase that. If we can do 14 or 16 or 18 hours, now we're allowing the body to break down more of that stored energy. We're allowing insulin to drop because we're going longer without food. And there's a difference because we're always making insulin. There's something called fasting insulin. So we're always releasing a little bit of insulin, and that's just to kind of cope with our gluconeogenesis. So you're between meals, your liver is still kicking out a little bit of glucose to maintain that basic level between meals. And we need just a smidgen of insulin for that. That's the fasting insulin. But when you eat a meal, and let's say like before you went low carb, your meal was 100 grams of carbs or 150. Now that's a mountain of carbs that your body has to process through. So in your bloodstream at any given time, you have about 3 grams. You have about a half a teaspoon of blood glucose. So, I mean, that's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit. And now you're throwing in 150 grams. That's a mountain. So that's a lot of insulin that your body has to produce to process through that meal. So that's why fasting is so powerful. The longer you do it, the more insulin is allowed to drop because there's longer between these mountains. And of course, if you eat low carb, now it's not a mountain, it's just a tiny little hill, little ant hill. So the longer you go, the more you allow that insulin to drop. And this is good for anybody. Like I said, I think that should be the default lifestyle. And I think that's how humans work physiologically. I think 1 or 2 meals a day. I typically do 1 larger and 1 smaller. And it just depends on what's going on. Sometimes I get busy, I go out somewhere and I don't eat. And then it's just 1 meal a day. But once people get used to this, almost without exception, they'll say, I don't understand why I ever did anything else. Because it's so easy, it's so natural, it feels like this is what I was supposed to do. There's no effort, it's just what I do. So that's kind of the first part. Then I think for people who are insulin resistant, they can change it up a little bit. I think they should have a minimum of a 16-hour window. So that means you eat during 8 hours. One or two, or well, 1 would be more, but let's say 2 or 3 meals, I think you can eat within an 8-hour period. But then it's going to depend on the person. Like, what does that do for you? Is your body changing? Are you losing weight? Is your glucose, is your insulin, are your triglycerides dropping based on that? If not, you got to do more. But even so, I think it's a good thing to change things up. And what a lot of people do with success is they'll skip a day. And that's what I call a 42-hour fast. So if you eat at 6 in the evening and you go to bed, you wake up the next day, and then you skip that whole day. When you wake up the next morning, you have 36 hours if you get up at 6. But then, since you're already used to intermittent fasting, you don't need to have breakfast right away. So if you wait till lunch, there's your 42 hours. And now that's a significant time span that is easier to do than most people think. Like, if you just don't really feel it too much, like don't notice too much how you feel, just assume you're going to go a day without eating, then once you wake up, you're almost there. And you have, in this 42 hours, you have 2 nights that make it really easy. Because when you're sleeping, you're not really paying attention to it. So it's like a third of this is automatic. So with those 42 hours, you are getting a lot of different benefits, a lot of metabolic benefits.
Talk about some of the benefits of intermittent fasting, and then some of the additional benefits extending out to 42 hours.
So if you're low carb or ketogenic, then you're making ketones already. And if you're not, by the time you get into 24, 36 hours, you are making ketones for sure, pretty much regardless of what you ate. But if you ate low carb before you started, you're going to be in a deeper level of ketosis. And ketones are brain fuel. So not everyone, but a lot of people will feel better because they're fueling their brain better during the state of ketosis. But ketones are also signaling molecules, and they signal against inflammation. They help lower inflammation in the body. So the ketone part is one aspect. Then the insulin part, like the longer you go, the more you allow it to drop. And for a lot of people, they'll find with a low carb or keto that their insulin might go from 20 to 12, but then it sort of plateaus. Well, these 42-hour periods are a great tool to break through those plateaus. And a lot of people will find that they'll they'll get these breakthroughs, and they'll find themselves at lower levels. And it's something that's not too hard to do, like once a week. Pick a day that works for you and say, I'm not going to eat on that day. And then there you have your 42-hour fast. And the thing that we mentioned briefly here is autophagy. And that's a process. Autophagy means self-eating. And that means when you don't eat food from the outside, your body starts looking for, where are the resources inside the body? Where can I find my stuff? And so we have plenty of energy. We have, even a very skinny person has enough fat on their body to live safely for several months. And carbs we don't need. So the big challenge, the big deficiency during a fast is protein. And protein becomes this precious thing that your body, the purpose of autophagy is that everything starts revolving around protein, about economizing with protein. And you do have some resources in the body that you can go after better. So the body gets better at recycling. It upregulates the cleanup crew, if you will, and it starts scouring the body for these things. And some of these are things you want to get rid of that helps your health. So you have dying cells, right? Unhealthy cells that are on their last breath. You have cell debris. You have residue from bacteria. And all of these contain a little bit of protein that you can now go and recycle. And one of the interesting things is that your brain, there's something called a blood-brain barrier. So the brain basically has a whole different circulatory system. It's got its own physiology, basically. A lot of things don't cross this blood-brain barrier, and bacteria don't cross. You don't really have an immune system the way we think of it, right? A lot of stuff doesn't get across. And one of the few ways that you have to clean up in the brain is autophagy. So one of the best things you could do if you have traumatic brain injury, if you hit your head, if you have a concussion, the absolute best thing you can do is to fast, because that jumpstarts that autophagy and helps clean up the damage after that brain injury. But it does help the whole body. So you start basically cleaning up better. And there's some wonderful anti-aging benefits, and autophagy, you can clean up even beginning cancers. The immune system upregulates. So there's a lot of this cleanup activity that has health benefits. And autophagy, really, it's a gradual thing, but it really doesn't kick in at all until 12 hours. And that's like, if you're in ketosis, then it's just like a smidgen after 12 hours. After 18, it's more significant, but it really starts kicking in after like 24 to 36. And then I believe after about 4 to 5 days is where you hit your maximum level of autophagy, and then it sort of levels off from there. But at 42 hours, you get very significant autophagy.
And under that umbrella of autophagy, would mitophagy be under that?
Yes. You're talking mitochondria? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And I don't know a ton about mitochondria, but they're becoming, they're raising more and more interest, because they are everything in our bodies depend on energy, and mitochondria are the things that produce our energy. And anything that benefits autophagy, like you said, myotophagy, we start breaking down dysfunctional mitochondria more so, and we're upregulating the rate of production. So we're basically getting younger and healthier and better performing mitochondria.
So when we get to this phase, autophagy, you mentioned the protein recycling. You've also talked about the muscle wasting. Are those connected? If somebody's on a longer fast, I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. Would that recycling and autophagy keep the muscle loss at bay?
There's some different opinions on this. Some of the people who did early research, they said that the body is so good at preserving protein, like we'll break down other things first. We'll break down fat and for energy, and long before we break down protein. So you would have to go like 2 weeks or more before there was any threat to the muscle. But then some other people more recently have said that no, it doesn't take that long. But I don't think you want to overdo it. I don't know that there's enough research and definitive knowledge. But I think it's totally safe and beneficial to do fasts up to 3 to 4 days, and that you could do those if you're metabolically healthy. I think you can do those every 6 months or maybe even quarterly. And if you are metabolically unhealthy, if you have type 2 diabetes or even cancer or something like that, I think that the benefits offset the downside. And I think you could do them even a whole lot more, like every month or so, because you're getting tremendous benefit. And I think the muscle wasting is minimal. One thing that I mentioned that high intensity interval training is one of the things that will produce the most growth hormone. Well, the only other thing that will produce more is fasting. Okay. And the reason is that human growth hormone is muscle sparing. So the body knows this. It says, hey, we're not eating, we're going into autophagy. We want to prevent muscle wasting. So let's crank that growth hormone through the roof and spare those muscles. So I don't know. I don't have the exact answer. I don't think that we need to be very afraid of it. I think 42-hour fasts are totally fine. And I think up to 3, 4, 5 days now and then are still fine.
Do you know at what point human growth hormone starts to spike?
I think that follows autophagy very closely. I think I researched that for a video, but I don't remember. But I would say that it probably starts kicking in significantly around 18 hours, just like autophagy. And I think it follows that curve.
What about other autophagy boosters? I know exercise is one. I believe there's supplements that can help. Anything in that realm you can share?
Not really. I've seen some things, but I don't remember.
During a fast, whether it be intermittent or longer, what do you personally, or somebody that you're helping through that, what can they drink?
Water is the number one thing. And I know there's some talk about dry fasting, but I think that's a very questionable way to go. I think the body depends on water, and the longer we go without, the more we can start compromising some of the other benefit. I don't really see a reason to do it. So drink plenty of water. If you like black tea or black coffee or green tea or herb tea, all of those are fine. And then I would strongly recommend people to do electrolytes. And I kind of designed an electrolyte for that purpose because it's very broad, but it also has some zinc and manganese in it to support some immune aspects, some metabolic benefits, and even some gut healing. Some of the things that can take place. And what happens when you fast is, especially if you're insulin resistant, then insulin tricks kidneys into retaining sodium. So when you're fasting, your insulin drops, and now your body isn't used to controlling sodium that way. The way it controls sodium changes, and you're going to lose electrolytes, primarily sodium, but you're going to lose some other ones as well. And a lot of the things that happen to people when they start keto, when they start fasting, they get brain fog, they get nausea, they get tired. Most of those things are due to loss of electrolytes. And normally, like my product, I made it so you could take 1 scoop a day. If you're working out, if you're sweating, you could take 2. But if you're fasting, you should take 3 or 4 scoops a day. And that also basically gives you all the potassium that you would need. And there's a lot of talk about sodium, and the guidelines have been restricting sodium forever, even though we need it. The biggest problem is the ratio, that all the processed foods have plenty of sodium, but they're totally stripped of potassium and magnesium. And the kidneys are designed to process these as couples. Like there's something called a sodium-potassium pump. It's one of the most interesting and most powerful things we have in our bodies. The sodium-potassium pump uses 40% of all the energy in your body. All the calories, all the energy you use, 30 to 40% goes into shuttling sodium and potassium back and forth. But in doing that, it shuffles sodium one way and potassium the other, and it changes the electrical potential of the cell membrane. So when your brain is sending signals, sodium rushes one way, and then the sodium-potassium pump has to pump it the other way to re-establish that electric potential. And this uses, like I said, 30-40% of all our energy. But the point is, the kidneys use the same sodium-potassium pump, and it uses all the different mechanisms are coupled. So it's never one thing going by itself. So when we have a ton of sodium in our diet without the other minerals, now we create an imbalance, and the kidney can't properly regulate these because it doesn't have the counterbalance, so to speak. So it's not that we need to cut back on sodium, really, it's that we need to make sure we get all the electrolytes. And during a fast, if you take enough electrolytes of a well-balanced brand, a lot of them hardly have any potassium, or they basically have salt, that's it. So they're kind of like processed food. But if you take one that's well-balanced, now you're helping your body during that fast to maintain proper levels. And I've had several people say that it's like, I've had a hard time fasting. When I did it with electrolytes, it was a breeze.
What's the ratio of your product?
So I have potassium is the heaviest. So I formulated it to where most people are going to put salt on their food. So you're going to get some sodium anyway. So during a fast, I would say add some extra sodium. I think I put 75 milligrams of sodium from pink salt. So you get a little bit of the trace minerals. I put 600 milligrams of potassium. And then I put, I believe 250 milligrams of sodium from sea salt, 75 milligrams of calcium. And that's also important, that it's not calcium carbonate, because that's basically chalk. It's useless. When you take a calcium supplement, you want it to be ionizable, right? Because that's the active form that supports your immune system and circulates in your bloodstream. And calcium lactate is the only one that's easily convertible to ionizable form. Then I have 110, something like that, of magnesium. And then I have a little bit of zinc and manganese, and both of those are chelated, meaning bound to a protein rather than a mineral salt, metal salt. It's more food-like, and it helps absorption. And then I also have a trace mineral mix, so you get a little bit of all the trace minerals as well to support you. And I mean, I spent some time coming up with that, and I think that's what the body needs when you're looking for. And I kept it does if that's all you do, it doesn't have enough sodium. So you want to add in a little bit.
So it sounds like people not using your electrolyte, the ratio of electrolytes is going to be off. They're going to be getting too much sodium. If somebody's in that position, what signs will they notice?
That I don't know. They might see higher blood pressure. It just depends on so many different factors, like where they are before and what else are they eating. If they're fasting and they're taking a ton of it, I think they're still kind of cleaning out their body enough that they probably wouldn't notice the symptoms. The first mineral you're losing is sodium. So that is the most important to replenish. It's like if you're only doing one thing, it should be sodium. But long term, that's not a great idea, because it's really the other stuff that you're missing more.
Okay, so for the general person, 1 scoop a day of this electrolyte you make.
Yeah.
What other supplements would you recommend people look into?
Are you talking my supplements or?
No, just for yourself,
Yeah.
for your wife,
Yeah.
other adults. What should people at least consider as part of their daily stack?
I think vitamin D. Unless you're getting a ton of sun in the summer, I think all other times you should make sure that you get vitamin D. I think when you do your blood work, you should make sure that vitamin D is something you're testing, both to make sure that you're getting enough, but also that you're not getting too much. So your blood test levels should be basically between 60 to 100, give or take. But if you, and here's the thing, some people need to take 10,000 IUs a day to stay above 60. But other people, if they take 10,000 IUs, it'll put them at 150, which is too much. Because vitamin D can also be toxic, and you don't want to have too much. But the amount needed differs greatly. Like some people will be fine with 2,000, some people need 5,000, some people need 10. So I think people need to take it, but I think they also need to monitor.
Okay, so electrolytes, vitamin D, any other notables?
I would say fish oil also. The omega-3s is a huge deficiency. And especially with as much seed oils as people eat, they usually have very unhealthy ratios between omega-6 and omega-3. And we have to have both, but most people are getting 20 times the amount of omega-6 that they need. So they're incorporating omega-6 into their cell membranes, and we have to have more like a 1-to-1 ratio. A lot of people are like 20-to-1 with omega-6 to omega-3. And it's the EPA and the DHA that we need, which is basically fatty fish or a fat omega-3 supplement, fish oil supplement. Now, if people like sardines or salmon, I mean, I buy my sardines like 6 dozen at a time, and I love them. And it's so easy, just pop open a can and gobble it down. And that basically, if you do that every day or most days, then that's all you need. You don't need a supplement. But if you don't eat fish, or if you don't eat them regularly, then that would be another thing that I look into.
Any tricks for making sardines taste good?
I don't know. I just like them.
Okay, I despise the taste. I push through and eat them, but just wonder if I'm missing something, putting lemon over it, cooking them, or I don't know.
Try other forms. Try like herring or mackerel or something else, because they're all very rich in omega-3, omega-6.
Okay, like I said, I push through, but I'd love to enjoy the experience.
And one more actually is, there is basically half the world's population has a genetic variant in a gene called MTHFR. And this reduces their ability to break down homocysteine. So homocysteine is a natural part of a metabolic chain in the body. The liver breaks down an amino acid called methionine, and it turns it into homocysteine. And then if we have all the pieces in place, the body breaks down that homocysteine also. But if you have this genetic variant, then you're not as good at breaking it down. And when this homocysteine accumulates and we get high levels, now that is inflammatory, and it's enough of a factor that it's an independent risk factor for heart disease. It increases inflammation. So this is something people want to look into, and you can do it two ways. You can get a genetic test and look for the MTHFR gene. That will kind of let you know how bad it is, how strong your tendency is, but it won't tell you if it's actually a problem. So for that, you want to do a homocysteine on your blood test. So when we test blood, it's a routine test for us because it's simple, it's easy. It's kind of like insulin. It adds $20 to the test. When you do it as part of a panel, it adds like $25, but it's very valuable information. And if your homocysteine is high, then you want to get something called methylated B vitamins. It's primarily MTHF, methyl tetrahydrofolate, but there's also a lot of other factors that go into it to complete the process, because there's like 2 pathways, and to cover them both, you need more than one ingredient. So I made a product for that as well, because it's just like insulin resistant. It's something that almost, or actually most of the world has this tendency. And it's probably that I always think about these things. It's like, why does genetic selection, why does evolution, whatever you choose to believe, put us here, why would that allow for a genetic defect in most people? And I'm thinking that it wasn't really an issue until we had our modern lifestyle, until we had a lot of toxicity and metabolic issues. But now that we do, it's a real thing.
Okay, a couple more questions as we close. Earlier, you mentioned your eating window really briefly. I'd love for you to go through a typical day, when you eat, what you eat.
So yesterday I had homemade fajitas, which means I put skirt steak on the grill. I fry up onions and bell pepper with olive oil, and then I make guacamole with that. Sometimes I have a little sour cream and a little salsa with that, but it's basically a very low carb meal. So that's kind of typical. Other times I'll have a ribeye with a salad, or a ribeye with tabbouleh. We've had that also this week. Today we are having a chicken wings with a salad. And either I do those on the grill, or I do them in a glass dish in the oven with lots of good spices. So, and so that's like for the main meal. Some days for my small meal, I'll have some yogurt, which I do homemade yogurt. I make sure it's like 8 to 10% fat in it, because then it gets really thick and delicious without having to strain it. And with the yogurt, I put chia seeds and pumpkin seeds. And this, for lunch, a couple hours ago, I had Swedish crisp bread, which is 100% rye, and it is 6 grams of carbs and a good amount of fiber, but like 6 grams of net carbs. So you can have 3 pieces and only get up to 18. And then I put a nice thick layer of butter on that. And then I had cold smoked salmon. And I sprinkled some lemon and put black pepper on it. So,
all right.
Need more examples?
No, that gives a good idea. But what about the eating window? And then outside that, when you are fasting, are you only having black coffee and water? Plus, I guess, the electrolytes.
For the most part, yes. I have a weakness for cappuccino. So sometimes I'll do just black coffee. Other times I'll do a cappuccino, but no sugar or anything. It's just I buy the grass milk, full fat, and I use about half a cup of that for a cappuccino. So it's not strict fasting, but again, I'm not looking to reverse anything per se. And then my typical eating window, very often I pretty much eat one meal. And on the other days, I have to confess that I don't eat as early as I would like to, because if I get busy, I get caught up in something. I sometimes don't eat until 8 or 9 in the evening, but I try to keep it like 6 or 7. But even so, my eating window is probably still within 6 or 7 hours.
Okay, last question. Somebody coming to this conversation, metabolically unhealthy, eating a standard type diet to this point, they're going to begin to turn things around. We've given them the hope, but they want a general dietary template. How do they begin starting today?
I would say to look up what paleo is. Like, just Google, give me a list, or put it in chat, give me 100 foods I can eat on paleo. And the biggest thing that they're going to cut out, if they start eating that list, it's not really restricting carbs or fat or protein or anything, but what they're going to find is they're already cutting their carbs by 2/3, because there's no grain, there's no sugar on the paleo diet. So, like I said, I had some crisp bread, which is 100% rye. But when I eat some grains, I try to stick to the ancient grains, stuff that has been around for thousands of years, that are our ancestors, not necessarily hunter-gatherers, but we've eaten them for a long time. And nature made them. Man didn't make them. They didn't manipulate them or hybridize them. So that would be the one thing. Because paleo it's basically what our ancestors ate. So it's going to be whole food. It's going to be food the way you find it or catch it or hunt it or pick it. And you can still cook it, cut it in pieces, etc., but it's not going to be hyper processed. It's still going to be basic food, but mostly like your ancestors ate. And with that, like I said, you're going to cut out your sugar, which is a drug. You're going to start controlling your hunger because you cut out the drug and you start eating real food. And then I would say, if you're new to this way of thinking, then go find 5 good channels like yours and mine, and a couple of more if you like, and watch something every day to educate yourself and to keep reinforcing your motivation and the importance of knowing this stuff.
All right, Dr. Ekberg, really enjoyed this. You're a wealth of information, and you have a great way of breaking down the science so we can all understand it. We're going to link up your electrolyte product, your YouTube channel, your website, everything in the show notes. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate that. I've had a wonderful time.
Me too. I hope we can do many more.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for watching the episode. I got another great one lined up for you right here. Don't miss it. I'll see you over there.
High blood glucose is one part of the problem. High insulin levels is a bigger part of the problem. High glucose causes swelling, microvessel damage, blindness, but high insulin clogs up the cell.